I'm Léon Benjamin. I'm going to be talking about why shift comes from within. Really big thank you, Steve, Laura, Isaac, Henry and the team for inviting me here today. It's really great to be kind of offline and connecting with a real community, as I keep saying to my kids, and that's one of the reasons why I've put this photograph up here. I know you're not kids, but I keep telling my kids that we used to have social networks when we were kids too, and we used to call it outside. And just some big picture stuff. I mean, do you ever get the sense that we live in a moment of history where the world is so speeded up that we begin to see the present only when it's just disappearing? You know, in the 1900s, the sum of human knowledge was doubling something like every 100 years or so, but today it's doubling every 2 to 3 years. We have we're in a stage, in a rate of change that is so high, that it's so sustained, that we're in a state where we could almost call this the new normal. Now, we're also seeing that the nature of work is changing. Competition has changed. Steve, years ago, you and I were talking about about that book called The World is Flat. And we found that something like 1.5 billion people have been added to the global labour pool. There are estimates that somewhere between 20 and 50 million PhD students will exist in Asia over the next 10 to 20 years, and that's aside from the millions of graduates that they're producing. Our traditional sense of work is changing radically. So historically, we would consider loyalty to work to be the way in which we were rewarded would be loyalty through length of service, whereas today job change, or rather historically job change, would be considered to be damaging to career, whereas today I think it's more about, people view it more as personal growth. And then finally, and I think crucially, the idea of a career historically has been about the responsibility for a company to provide, whereas I think today it's really about the responsibility of the individual to pursue. And what we're also finding is some really interesting, it's not even emerging because I think they're here already, we're finding some very interesting organizational forms emerging, or in fact they're already here. So if we look at the open source community, and I know it's a big story, it's been around for a long time, but I think a lot of people forget quite how powerful that model of organization is now. If you take, for example, SourceForge, which is a community of software developers, there are like 1.9 million developers working on 80,000 projects, and I would challenge that there is probably no company on the earth today that could manage that number of projects with that number of people, whether it was IBM or Microsoft or Oracle. Some of the biggest internet brands that we have today could not exist without the existence of open source software. And very recently, research has found that it produces, this collective wisdom produces software that has much lower defects, it's of much higher quality. Facebook, Amazon, Google, none of these companies could exist without this open source software based on this new model of organization. I think one of the most interesting startups that I've seen or heard about in the last few years, a company called Mob for Hire. It was started, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 years ago by a couple of guys who were actually, Paul, a bit like you, ex-management consultants who were kind of fed up with the way things were being organized. And this is a company that you can effectively give a mobile application to, and they'll test it in every language, in every country, on every device. This is a company that's run by 10 people, and it manages a field force of 43,000 agents all around the world. And when they set themselves up, to manage these 43,000 people, they used 4 pieces of collaborative software, 3 of which were free. But I think from a shift perspective, the one thing certainly that I'm seeing in the world today is that purpose is pretty much everything. So in Japan recently, I don't know whether you know this, but in Japan, something like there are something like 20,000 companies that are over 100 years old. And there are some companies that are as old, that are 1,000 years old. And some researchers recently discovered they wanted to have a look at this and find out exactly what made these companies live so long. And they found that almost without exception, all of these companies were founded on a central belief that was not solely tied to profit. I mean, even in Okinawa, which is one of Japan's poorest regions, the people of that region have got even though they're incredibly poor, have got some of the highest life expectancies in the world. And again, some researchers found that actually, if you have purpose in your life, there is a causal relationship between that and living longer. Can a company live forever, though? That's the question. And in the 1920s, well, can a company live forever? Probably not in the West, possibly in the East. But in the 1920s, the average lifespan of a company on the S&P 500 index was something like 67 years, and today it's only 15 years. We're seeing that, we're seeing a lot of iconic companies, iconic brands kind of disappearing. I don't know, Nokia, BlackBerry, Kodak more recently. And again, if you look at the post-mortems associated with those companies, a lot of them have been associated with essentially lack of purpose. I think companies haven't realized that they can make more money if money wasn't the only thing on their mind. Reading some of the obituaries of those companies, it's like almost reading a Shakespearean tragedy. Passion and purpose, I think, are everything. Passion in particular, because passion tends to remove the need for willpower. So the shift that I'm talking about really is one that's caused a fundamental shift in attitude towards the purpose of work. And I sense now that people view work really as an instrument of self-development and personal autonomy. And a career really having ceased to be a kind of a realistic or feasible way of organising your working life. And so, and we talk about entrepreneurship as well. I think entrepreneurship is really more of an attitude rather than a status symbol. And I think it's an attitude that all of us are going to need. And I think this attitude and this sense of purpose and pulling all of those things together will enable us to see what everyone else has seen, but to think what nobody else has thought. And maybe it will help us develop a healthy disrespect for the impossible. And that's why I think shift comes from within. Thank you.